In fact, I'll end my presentation with a slide on restoration because in trying to decide what justice calls for, we can pause and think, okay, does this restore a relationship? Does this restore a human being to the life-giving, liberating love of God? Because if it restores someone or restores a relationship or brings restoration to the world, then that's a pretty good indicator to pursue justice in that area. Okay. I hinted at this, I guess it was last week, that in my legal days of hanging around the courthouse, it was deeply ingrained in me that justice, or the symbol of justice, was Lady Justice, if you will, holding balanced scales, and she's blindfolded. She can't see the litigants. And that's still a great metaphor for what's supposed to happen in the courthouse. But that is not a very good symbol when it comes to social justice. The prophet Amos said, "Let justice roll down like righteousness, an everlasting stream." So I want you to kind of hold those two together. It's both in a way. We still have the need for balanced scales when it comes to legal justice, but we need the powerful rushing water symbol in the other kind of justice, social justice. This probably goes without saying, but it's always an effort to do justice. And I had my little book with me, but I think I left it in the sacristy. That's okay. I can tell you what I was going to read to you. It was a quote from Ecclesiastes, because Ecclesiastes had a keen sense of the way the world operates. He said, "Behold, I look out on the square, and there's injustice and oppression. He said, and there's no one to help." That's the situation that he perceived. But of course, as Christians, as followers of Jesus, we know that that's not true, because Jesus is in God, in the Spirit, or on the job, if you will, 24/7, working through us, of course. But because there's so many powerful structures that try to maintain the status quo, it really takes effort. In family systems theory, there's a word called homeostasis. And I'm going to tell you what, homeostasis is a tough nut to crack. There's homeostasis in a church family. There's homeostasis in your nuclear family. And if you try to change the way things are operating in any system, there's going to be resistance to the change. It's just the way we're hardwired. And so when we try to change systems of injustice, we can expect resistance. This should be the primary obligation of the people of God. Several of the prophets would go before the people in their message and say, listen, true worship of God is not the burning of incense or the saying of long prayers or having a magnificent liturgy. All of that is bankrupt unless the people of God are pursuing justice. In fact, Amos says religious performance nauseate God. Now think about that one a minute. Your incense nauseates me when I see what's going on in your city, okay? That's how important justice is to God. As I mentioned a moment ago, it's all about relationships, our relationship with God, with creation, and with each other. It's not a private affair. We're all in this pursuit of justice together. Bishop, you'll hear in Sarah's sermon, she mentions the 3 L's from Bishop Curry, the life-giving, liberating love of God. And our relationships with God and with one another should be characterized by those 3 L words. And justice is measured by how well we live into that in our relationships. How well do we respect the dignity of every human being? This was a principle. I mentioned restoration a minute ago, but sometimes you wonder, when is it appropriate to show mercy? When is it appropriate for there to be, if you will, a retributive or a punitive kind of justice? And the key is restoration. You know, those of us who've raised children or had grandchildren, I mean, there's times when a timeout is appropriate. But when the timeout has done its work, it's time for some mercy, okay? if a child or an adult or a nation or whatever has already repented, changed its or his or her ways, then the need for retribution or punishment no longer exists. When sometimes punishment is necessary in the penal system to bring about repentance and restoration. But if it's not necessary to bring about restoration, then we shouldn't engage in that. So justice and mercy are really the same thing. It's just the different poles of a dynamic at work, because it's all about building up and restoring relationships. And sometimes, as you see, mercy is the best way to get to restoration of a relationship. I mentioned that in legal justice, we've got the scales, the equality, the impartiality, and all that's true in the Bible as well as our American system. But there is a definite partiality when it comes to social justice. Think about this for a minute. If we have agreed, and the United Nations said this, that there's a basic right to food, clothing, some kind of shelter, and even a primary education around the world, these basic rights have been recognized by the UN since 1948. And we see in the Bible the need for support for widows, orphans, resident aliens, people who are vulnerable, okay? And for those folks to have this, if you will, sort of a minimum level of life, the things needed for life, there sometimes has to be a partiality shown. In some ways, justice depends on the circumstances. It's contextual. I mean, just like with your child, you've got to know the circumstances. You've got to know the facts in order to decide how to pursue your relationship with your child. It's contextual, right? It all depends on the circumstances. Well, when it comes to social justice, the same thing applies. It depends on the circumstances. Because if somebody doesn't have a minimum threshold of what it takes to live a good life, I think it's someplace in the little book, if they don't have what it is needed to flourish, okay? If their life is not flourishing for they're lacking in certain essential things, then in the Bible and in the Christian tradition, there is a partiality. You know, it's that word, I think, grates on people sometimes, okay? You know, there's pushback sometimes. But biblical justice is not just straight equality regardless of somebody's circumstances. Biblical justice takes into account someone's circumstances. And so you consider that before formulating what to do. Let me just pause here. Any questions, or does this stir up anything in you? I'm kind of blowing through some of this because we have a lot of material to cover today.
So something that stirred up in me is when you were talking about justice and mercy and focusing on justice as restorative or imposing a punishment or something. I can be naive in this way. That sort of justice feels like the sort of thing you do after you've tried all the mercy and your patience has run out. And that was my reaction to what you were talking about.
I think that's a good point, because if you ever spend any time in the courtroom or the courthouse, you know, when a teenager gets in trouble, you know, usually it's not a major infraction at the beginning. So your juvenile court, circuit court judges, the last thing they want to do is put somebody in jail that doesn't belong there, because jail is a last resort. Jail sometimes hardens people, sadly, rather than restores them. It ought to be restorative, but it doesn't always work that way. So and I think the Bible is very consistent with what you're saying. You go back to the book of Exodus, when Moses was receiving the revelation of God, he heard God saying, the Lord, who is merciful to the 1,000th generation, but visits the sins of the fathers and mothers only unto the 3rd or 4th generation. So if you're looking at the character of God, Mercy is stacked up 30 or 300 generations higher, if you will, than a judgmental God, if you will. So yeah, there's definitely a default toward compassion.
Good morning. So
Morning.
on the way over here, we were having this discussion about our families. And my sister has 4 children, and I am a single mom of a daughter. And we were talking about the autonomy that you have when you have a single unit without a lot of players versus, which is Kathy's experience, and then you just have this. She said it's like ships in the night. You know, you're everybody's working and moving forward and doing good, and then when you have more players, it's a little more difficult. And my sister, I'll just tell you this. So my sister was, she has some warring parties in her family, and I was, just being a listening ear, and then she turns on me and she said, well, you just didn't have enough children. You just don't understand. So it's that, but my point is like you were talking about the homeostasis. So what's for one is not for another, in your family or group setting or.
It's definitely contextual. And every system is different. And things change over time. We're always having to adjust. But there's one thing that's a pole star, though, and that is God's on the side of life-giving relationships. What is it that's going to bring about life? What is it that's going to bring about restoration? And that's oftentimes compassion. Okay, let me go through another one here. I think we've covered this pretty well, but maybe it bears repeating that when people are impoverished and oppressed, it is definitely contrary to God's intentions for the world. You go all the way back to the oppression and the slavery in Egypt. All through the ages, God's not happy with oppression. God's not happy with people who are starving or being abused. So anything to bring about change there is going to be the pursuit of justice. And we know some groups are more frequent victims of injustice in the world. I mean, it's there. We live in a broken world. We live in a world, I'll say, that's under construction. The kingdom is breaking in. The kingdom is happening in places, but we're not there yet altogether. This author in the book, so I'll just mention these 4, sees 4 different ways that God's justice is visible in practice in the world. 1, through the historic intervention for Israel. 2, through inclusion in God's law of specific provisions and protections. All right? For example, when the people who were raising grain in the book of Leviticus, they were commanded not to harvest every last stalk of grain. They were supposed to leave the edges and the corners of the field so the vulnerable, like the widows, the poor, the resident, could go into the field and pick what was left. Everybody got something to eat. Okay, so there were welfare provisions in God's law for the vulnerable. The same should be true in our own. The third way that God brings about justice in the world is raising up prophets to confront us. That grinding poverty, for example, is not God's will. And, I love the prophetic word, but especially if I'm the one saying it. But to be honest, to be human, sometimes the prophetic word is confrontational, and it can make me feel uncomfortable. Sometimes I have to let it soak in to receive the truth. At first I can feel the resistance in me sometimes to a prophetic word of truth, all through my life. Sometimes it takes time to really hear that truth and to process and realize, even though I'm not totally comfortable, I realize this needs to happen to be able to move to a place of acceptance. And the last way that God brings justice to the people is that everlasting promise that a kingdom is coming. A new day is coming. You'll often hear, I grew up in the Delta, so I've heard a lot of black preaching in my life, but over in that part of the world, the sermon almost always ends with celebration because there's a new day coming. Because God is not through with this world yet. There's a new day coming. We have to have hope. So we have to hear again that everlasting promise where God is in this equation. I mentioned the restoration. Let me just give you this one quote from Ezekiel. Have I have any pleasure in the death of the wicked, and not rather that they should turn from their ways and live, it's what it should say, not leave, typo on me. I'm not a fan of capital punishment. I don't see any hope for restoration in capital punishment. To me, it's a fundamental violation of some of the deepest principles of justice when we give up on a human being and we don't let God continue to work in that human being's life. So it's all about, in the end, restoration and restoring to Shalom, or restoration to the kingdom. Sarah, or any other questions as she's walking forward? And hopefully we'll have some at the end too. Okay. I want to be sure we have plenty of time for this guy. Yes.
Yeah, Danny said, I want to hear more about what Jesus has to say. So we'll hear what Jesus has to say, hopefully, it's on Jesus. And Danny, do you want to turn your mic off? Okay. So I've got another video for us that we'll watch this first, just to kind of make sure that we don't get too ideological, thinking about like ways that justice is perceived biblically, that we also bring it to the here and now. So we'll watch this real quick.
You there, second desk, blue jacket. What is your name?
My name is Alexis.
Alexis, please leave my lecture room. I don't want to see you at one of my lectures ever again.
I don't understand.
I am not going to ask a second time. Thank you. Why are there laws? What are laws for? Anyone?
Social order?
To protect a person's personal rights.
So that you can rely on the government?
Justice?
Thank you. Tell me, was I unfair to your classmate just now? Indeed I was. So, why didn't any of you protest? Why didn't any of you try and stop me? Why didn't you want to prevent this injustice? You see, what you have just learnt, you wouldn't have understood in 1,000 hours of lectures unless you lived it. You didn't say anything because you weren't affected yourself. And this attitude speaks against you and against life. You think it doesn't concern you, so it's none of your business. Well, I'm here to say, if you don't help bring about justice, then one day you too may experience injustice, and there will be nobody there to stand before you. Truth and justice lives through us all, and we must fight for it. Because in life and work, I mean, we often live next to each other, but not with each other. We console ourselves that the problems of others are nothing to do with us, none of our business. And we go home glad at night that we're spared, but it's about standing up for each other. Every day an injustice happens in business, sport, or on the tram. Relying on someone else to take care of it is not good enough. It is our duty to be there for others, to speak up for others when they cannot. I am here to teach you the power of your voice. I want you to learn critical thinking to empower you to stand up for what is right, even if it means going against what everyone else is doing. Let's begin.
Video. I chose that video because I felt like it has a lot to say about what we've been talking about and a lot about what Jesus shows us too. But what thoughts do you have? Anything stand out to you? Aside from the fact that it's incredibly choreographed, I realize that too. I don't think that was an impromptu class section, Danny.
Well, it's a prime example of speaking truth to power. And, you know, the students didn't, you know, like they are kind of underlings in respect to this is a professor. You know, they don't want to speak up because they are expecting a good grade, and so they don't want to go against the, against the chafe.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. That power dynamic. Wow. Triniss?
Yeah, I was waiting to see if there was going to be some contextual interjection, like something that nobody knew, like, I don't know, that she had done something else. I kind of wanted to hear the full story and was wondering, was there more to the story? And apparently there wasn't.
I think it's a short intended to make that one point. So, yeah. I don't complicate it more than any more complicated than justice is. So.
It reminded me, in social psychology, it's called diffusion of responsibility. When something like that happens and there's a bunch of people, everybody will look to everybody else to do something. Therefore, nobody does anything. If you're there by yourself, you'll speak up.
Why they say like a choking person chokes to death in a restaurant because everybody thinks somebody else is going to do it.
You know, it's like, well, are they going to say something? So therefore, nobody. In other words, the responsibility is diffused among everybody. So that you don't feel guilty for not saying anything. Yeah. Where if you were there by yourself, you would be more likely to stand up and say, hey, this isn't right, because all the responsibility would be yours.
Yeah, good point. Other thoughts or comments?
Well, just to reiterate, it's just incredibly challenging and uncomfortable to stand up for what's right in our society. In our community.
No. Susie?
Especially when we're raised in a society that you are taught to respect power, and that's the voice, the authoritarian voice. And so it is highly difficult to then be the one in that group to stand up to power.
And to even further complicate that, thinking about if I, as a white presenting, upper middle class woman speak to power. It's like I'm speaking from a place of privilege too, and I might also be critiqued for like, oh, well, you're privileged, you can do that where other people can't. So it's almost doubled up. It becomes exponential in some ways to be difficult, or the consequences and repercussions from it. Well, that was just a little, to get your brain thinking in a lot of different ways and hearing other voices. We continue with chapter 4. So Jesus and justice, and basically Jesus is the fulfillment of biblical hope. And we learn about this fulfillment of justice through Jesus' life and teaching and activities. And we might think, generally in church, we talk about, well, Jesus is the way, the truth, and the life. And we talk about it in these, beautiful, flowy, theological terms. But what if we just boiled it down and said Jesus' life is about justice? You feel like somebody's like throwing a gauntlet? Like, let's play that card. Because when it comes down to it, the book says, people want to say Jesus is just religious. But the life of Jesus was also political. It wasn't separate from. If you know anything about Middle Eastern culture and the countries over there, you realize their religion and their politics are intertwined. They're not separate. And the institutions that Jesus navigated were deeply intertwined in the political. So Jesus knew what he was doing when he invited the tax collectors, when he sat and went to dinner with those whom he wouldn't be socially acceptable to eat with, when he was speaking to the scribes and Pharisees, when he was speaking to Pontius Pilate. Jesus knew what he was doing when he entered Jerusalem on the mule and donkey while the troops were entering in through the nether gate. Right? He knew what he was doing. And so the book outlines that Jesus had a twofold strategy for bringing about justice: to denounce the injustice of society and calling for a new community, calling for that new day. So Jesus denounces injustice of society and calls for a new community. Are there stories that come to mind for you before I go any further about what is your favorite Jesus sticking it to the man story? Do you have one? Or is that how you think about it? Is that not how we're supposed to talk about the Gospels? I invite you to consider, what does Jesus do that's new and different, that's your favorite example? Or what brings you a sense of hope when you think about what Jesus did that was different? Danny in the back.
One of my favorite is whenever he asks people to consider their sins before casting punishment on somebody else.
Yeah, and that story came up last week or the week before. The woman caught in adultery, and he's like, well, hey, you without sin cast the first stone. I'll wait.
Yeah. Leave your family behind and follow me, and I'm coming to bring conflict. Everything is going to change, is the message that comes to me.
From last Sunday's gospel, I come not to bring peace but a sword, put everybody against everybody else. Yeah.
My favorite is harvesting the wheat on Sabbath so people could eat.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Well, I'll leave that question with you to think about, what your favorite story about Jesus kind of rocking the boat in there. Remember, Jesus went into the temple and flipped over the tables. What is it in Mark or Matthew where he takes the lasso or the rope and he's he's just clearing the floor and getting everybody out. Nobody wants to get caught by a whip. They're getting out of town, but he demonstrates an anger at what is happening. And that anger isn't just because they're getting bird poo all over the narthex, right? Although I imagine it was a very messy entryway before they go into the temple. It wasn't about the the liturgy or anything like that. It was about how people were being exploited in that. Jesus got mad. So here's Jesus' strategy in action. It kind of outlines these steps or these examples. Rejection of social discrimination. Right? Jesus talked to the women. Jesus sat with the sinners. Jesus invited the tax collectors. Jesus cured, healing people who were untouchable, right? You don't go and hang amongst those with what we'll call leprosy. They have contagious diseases. I would say like Jesus wouldn't probably be isolated from the hospitals during a COVID pandemic. Jesus went where the outcasts were, went where he wasn't supposed to go. And so he didn't uphold the status quo. And critique of economic injustice. I love how it says, you will always have the poor among you. Well, if we read the Bible quite literally, we can say, well, there's always going to be poor among us. That's just a given. That's just the way that life is. And here's some rules that that gives us actions to do to make us feel better about ourselves and feel like God is looking upon us with approval. But Jesus is saying, or God is saying, that you will always have the poor among you because we're always going to fall short in our obedience to God. I've mentioned that in my sermon today too. Because the economic injustice, like we're not supposed to have, 10 or like, what is it, the wealth that the U.S. has of the world? Is it 30% of the world's wealth or more? But we have so much more of the world's wealth just like in our country than all over the globe. So how can, is that equitable? Is that right? Is that just? Do I say, well, I'm working harder, so I deserve to make more than my siblings in a country where they live on less than $1 a day? What is the equity? Where's the justice in that? Because when the beginning of creation, God created enough, right? So Jesus critiques economic injustice, the mistrust of institutional power. Jesus is like, I see you in your pretty little hierarchies and pretty little buildings, and I cast it all down. It will be broken and it will be raised up. Not raised up in a beautiful new temple, but you are the temple. It doesn't say that, but like Jesus being raised up, Jesus Christ being able to be present to everyone, everywhere, that we carry the presence of Christ in our church. Where 2 or 3 are gathered, Christ is there with us. The church looks like us doing ministry and action, following the mission of God. The institutional power, the human systems get it wrong all the time. Jesus called that out. A repudiation of war and violence. Jesus is about to be arrested, and one of his righteous disciples goes up and cuts the ear of another one. Because stop it, you're not taking Jesus. This is wrong. And what is Jesus? Does he say, yeah, go get that guy? No. I just imagine him putting a hand on his ear and it being healed. It was one of our morning prayer lessons this week. Puts the hand over the ear and it heals. Because like we said earlier, in the book it says you can't have justice through non-peaceful means. So we can only have justice through peace. Jesus shows us the way of nonviolence, even unto death. He doesn't counter that. Any thoughts about like Jesus' strategy? Do you think that this is a misread of Jesus' life, his teachings, his example for us?
I was just thinking about this and what Danny was saying earlier about the prophets saying your rituals, I'm abhorred of your rituals. Yeah. And I'm trying to remember, I think it was in Richard Rohr's Universal Christ. He talks about when the cup of the wine is shared, and he says, this is my blood. He says, a mystical and a liberation theology interpretation of that is that this is the blood of any person, blood shed unjustly. And it's not just about personal forgiveness, but it's about a sense of being communally connected. where there's injustice in the world when we take the cup. And I thought, wow, that's an example of symbolic ritual having potential to be powerful, depending on how it's understood and how it's presented. And frequently, we just turn it into a personal, I'm forgiven, rather than I'm part of something. You know?
Yeah.
His action, I think of Jesus' life as he's a disruptor of the social norms, and it's similar to me to like Crystal Bridge, the difference between going to Crystal Bridges and the momentary. You know, Crystal Bridges, everything's soothing and arty, and you know, you're at peace. And then when I go to the momentary, it's disruptor art. It's disruptor art. But you know, when days later I am thinking about this disruptor art, it changes my thought patterns. And I just want to tell everybody, if you haven't heard, they're knitting an American flag, the 4th through they started yesterday through the 4th, and then it's going to be displayed. And it's going to be a big one. It's in the boiler room, and they have, I don't know, they're using a crane. So, but it sounds fascinating. But Jesus as a disruptor, that he changes your thought pattern.
Thank you.
It's going to be the biggest American flag that has ever been knitted. And it's online and visible to everybody.
So probably if you go to the Momentary website, you can get a link to see it. An American flag being knit to the pattern. So, yeah. Julie?
What I'm starting to hear from this is that we should be critical and not just accept our society's norms and what we're doing every day, and just really think it through so that we could be disruptors also.
Yeah, so hearing that call to notice. Liz, did you still have something you wanted? Oh. No, okay.
All right.
Whoops.
Okay.
Okay.
Fool me. It's like an auction. If you raise your hand, you might buy something.
Well, of course, I just think of all the times Jesus disrupted the law as well, in terms of just ignored and healed people on Sunday, all those different things. And so maybe it's because it's the 4th of July and Independence Day and what that means to you as citizens. And when we were singing My Country 'Tis of Thee, I remember singing that as a child every morning at Washington School, 2 blocks up the street, along with the Pledge of Allegiance and prayer. But here's my deal. I have trouble separating the social justice, the political feelings, and religion. And that's where, for me, it is very difficult. And it seems like that wasn't necessarily a problem for Jesus. And so that is an issue for me, and I believe an issue for our country, because I do believe our religion is dictating much of our political actions in this country.
Yeah. Yeah, negatively or positively. Yeah, negatively and positively, yeah. Go ahead, Liz.
Change your mind.
Before I was just getting my hair up because I was hot.
Oh, okay.
But now I do have something to say. I was really hot.
It's like an auction. You raise your hand, you're getting called up.
But I do want to say something. When you say disruptor, that seems to have an aggressive tone about it. And I think that's what's wrong with society now, because you can't agree to disagree. And I just remember Ruth Bader Ginsburg. She was friends with lots of chief justices that were on the opposite side of her. Even though they felt very differently, they didn't fight about it. They were still friends. They still had a lot in common. And I don't like the word disruptor, really, because I think disruptor sounds like cause a problem or be aggressive. And I don't think you have to be aggressive to make that point.
Thank you for saying that.
I'd just like to say Jesus struck a balance. He was assertive, but not aggressive.
Mm-hmm.
He was assertive, but not aggressive. And I think that's important. And I think you have to be aggressive to make that point. Thank you for saying that. I just like to say Jesus struck a balance. He was assertive, but not aggressive.
Mm-hmm.
don't know. I just think of people that have certain customs and has never been anywhere else into the world to see their customs. And they think their customs is right because that's all they know. And that kind of reminds me of the churches back then. And maybe he's saying, you got to love everybody and everybody's customs, because just because those are your customs does not mean that's going to be right. You know, it's all about love. And when you talk about disruption, maybe he was just going against the common customs of the time, you know, and, you know, it's maybe some other people's customs are better than ours.
When I use the term a disruptor, I don't mean anything caustic. I just mean it's just a different way of looking at things. And so, but it is disruption of the day, you know, because going against the status quo was a very dangerous thing.
So the thing that has dawned on me over time, being a part of St. Paul's over the last 10 years, is it's, in the past I would have agreed, and I still do to a certain degree, about can't we talk without fighting and arguing? But on the other hand, the more I become involved with people who are really struggling and are on kind of the people who have the foot on their necks, I understand more clearly the passion and desire to disrupt and to have change rather than to say, oh, can't we just agree to disagree? You know?
Thank you. And we have like 5 or so more minutes, so I want to make sure to wrap it up. And make sure to go back also to Susan's point about, you know, Jesus didn't really seem to have a problem. Like, Jesus wasn't a 501c3 at risk of losing funding for being political. But there is a difference between being politically engaged as a responsible citizen, and me telling you to vote for XYZ candidate. That's the distinction. Like, when we're talking about social justice, we're talking about welfare of people. In community organizing, they talk about it being a nonpartisan thing, because we find what are those common things that we hold to be true. What was our common understanding of justice, and what will we advocate for policy-wise change? Because if we get down to it, like, the things that we see are just symptoms of deeper rooted problems, systemic injustice, right? So what are those systems that need reform, that need to be disrupted to change and have a different result, right? And so Jesus was showing us that it's possible. And as long as we work to that end, that our life will not be in vain, that God recognizes the work that we're doing, and that we can work to bring about that change, hopefully, sooner than later. I don't believe that I'll, you know, see or experience justice in our country in my lifetime. I can hope for it, and I can continue to try to help bend that arc toward it, but I don't see that it's going to fully be realized in my lifetime. Alan, did you have something you want to say? Did you have? No? Okay. So in the last little bit, I wanted to be sure to give us examples of ways that we are both doing it, like living into the life and teaching of Jesus in ways that we could. At the top left, we recognize Martin Luther King on one of the marches, right? A clergy person beside him, people with him, walking arm in arm on the front lines for social justice. Looks like they're advocating for wage. I heard that a lot of pictures of like MLK and the civil rights movement are in black and white to distance us from how recent they really were. So finding images in color reminds us that this wasn't just a long time ago in a land far away. Like, this was in some of y'all's lifetime. It was before my lifetime, but and some of your lifetimes, right? And so in the bottom, you're right, is that's the Reverend Dr. William Barber and the Poor People's Campaign, which is a resurrection of Martin Luther King's original Poor People's Campaign. And that's like in this millennia, like that's in the past 10 years. And the Poor People's Campaign has been happening. I'm thinking about what St. Paul's is doing with the Magdalene Serenity House. When we talk about restorative justice, when we talk about restoration, restoring somebody to their fullness of life in whom God has created them to be. I mean, that's the whole basis for Thistle Farms, on which Magdalene Serenity House is based. And if you haven't seen New Beginnings in South Fayetteville, the little houses, I mean, that's trying to do something actionable to provide housing for people who are transient for whatever reasons. Maybe it's situational, maybe it's their life conditions. So there are things that we are doing here in this community that are because we believe Jesus and what Jesus taught and what we understand justice to be. Like, these are actionable things that we are doing, that we are working for. And it's not just, having the little free pantry and the little free fridge. Those are important because we need to make sure people are fed and have their basic, nourishment so that they can do other things, namely live. But what are we doing to change upstream what is causing that system, that symptom? I'm preaching to the choir, I know this. But are you hearing anything that inspires you in a new way? Are you hearing something in a new way that you didn't think about or maybe haven't heard before that is inspiring to you? Like, pull an EFM question, you're like, what is the Holy Spirit calling you to do differently? Because now you can't say, I didn't know. Mary? Oh, Danny ran off with the microphone. Oh.
I just wanted
Hold it real close.
or to ask, where does a
Hold it close.
peaceful protest movement function here? So in the classroom, when the professor said, none of you spoke up, what if they had all stood up and said, what you did was wrong, but nobody did?
Yeah.
So I think it is very important that we appear as a group peacefully, not provoking or causing any kind of conflict, but to say, here we are, and we are in numbers, like the Pride Parade.
Yeah.
These things indicate we are here, and we think, and we have a point of view. Yeah.
That's a big invitation for me to get on a soapbox. Do you want to give me a minute? Yeah. But I think that's the excellent point to make. Like, Pride is a beautiful example of what the love, if you were there, if you experienced that, like, just going and being, it's like, let's abide in this love 365, 24/7. Like, that is beautiful. What isn't as beautiful is those other times of the year when people say things that are little microaggressions that resemble homophobia or racism or any kind of prejudice like that. When I have to call somebody out on my own, or when I'm the only person that's in that quorum court, to speak against an issue that it seems like the majority is against anyway. How many of you have ever been somewhere and you just believe something so deeply in your being, and you talk and you just feel your whole body trembling because you know without a doubt that what you're speaking is the truth and it is right and it is good, and for the love of God, why can't people just understand that we're doing this to help raise up one another? And why can't they see that? Have you ever had those? I'm seeing a lot of heads nodding. Because we live in an imperfect society, and not everybody wants to think outside of their own person. It doesn't affect me. I can go about living my life. I can retire. I've got a pension, like all these things. Like, I can just go to work and watch my shows and scroll the social media and go to bed and wake up and have my coffee and do the whole thing over again. And I can be unscathed by what's happening in France. And I can be unscathed by what's happening in Minneapolis. Or what happens anytime that something devastating happens to somebody else, but I can't see it from my backyard. So I don't have to do anything about it. Thank you, James.
I think these past few Sundays being here at 10 o'clock, what it has done is we recognize these things that are actionable and those feel good, but there's a lot of inner work that has to be done to think about what is biblical Jesus, what does biblical justice look like. And so I thank you and Danny for that, but I think that's part of what this has done for me is there's personal work to be done.
Well, and I know that you and Jim and others who are involved in the Becoming Beloved community, like actively doing anti-racism work to discover personal biases. In August 13th, we're going to start a Sacred Ground Circle. If you've heard about the Sacred Ground curriculum that the Episcopal Church has, it kind of looks at the history of our country and just kind of goes through it in relation to like why there might be some discrimination happening, or like what are some of the things that have occurred throughout our country's history that sets up a system that really enables white supremacy, and how is the church implicated in that? And it's really a great entry point if you think like, I don't even want to know about this because it's too much to add to my plate and I've already got compassion fatigue for all the other things that I'm advocating for. It really is just an invitation to know and learn more. And if that's not where you are right now in your journey, if you can't take that, by all means, don't do it. But if you want kind of like, it's not like reading White Fragility, let me put it that way. So it's more of like a softer entryway into like, let me just see the cards on the table. And if I want to, get more information, then I can go deeper from there. So that's one invitation that comes, because we're going to continue doing justice work for forever. And I'm thankful to be at St. Paul's where we are doing justice work, where I can think of concrete examples right off the bat of ways that we're trying to help disrupt the status quo in a way to raise up those valleys. Because we know that our neighbors are suffering, and because we're compassionate, because Jesus told us to be compassionate, how are we addressing that and what are we doing? All right. Well, thank you all. Let's go rush to church. Thanks so much.